Hey all you heroes and champions, crows, pirates, and inquisitors. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast. I'm Shelby.
And I'm Austin.
And we are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe. From the Maker to Lyrium to Aravels, we will cover it all. There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hey, Shelby.
Hey, Austin.
How's it going?
Great.
You ready to talk about some Dragon Age?
I really am. Let's do it.
All right, so we're continuing our Countries of Thedas series. And who do we got today, Shelby?
Well, today we're going to tackle two countries. But they're really close to each other and they share some similarities. So we are talking about Antiva and Rivain.
So some countries that we might have heard, but we have not been to.
Yeah, we have not yet visited these countries, which I really want to go to Antiva and DA for. Mm-hmm. So we'll see if we get to do that or not.
Yes, we will see. All right. Well, let's just dive right in.
Okay, well, I always start with a few fun facts about the country. And today is no different. So a little bit about Antiva is that Antiva is located in northeastern Thedas on the Rialto Bay. They are ruled by a king or a queen that usually has a royal family. But even though the line of kings in Antiva has remained unbroken for like 2,500 years, the monarchy is very weak, and has virtually no power in Antiva. In reality, Antiva is a plutocracy, which means the true power of the country is determined by who has the most wealth. In Antiva, this takes the shape of the merchant princes and kind of also in the Antivan Crows. And Antiva really becomes a nation in its own right around -30 ancient. So right when the Chantry calendar and all of that is getting established. I also wanted to read a quote from the Dragon Age wiki. And this is just talking about the merchant princes, because we hear the word princes and we think, oh, like they're royalty, but they're really not. But this is what it says. They're not princes in the literal sense, but heads of banks, trading companies, and vineyards, each with a personal army and each locked in a constant struggle against all of the others. They possess sufficient capital to resolve any external diplomatic quandaries with a well-aimed purse or the threat of withdrawn trade. And it's important to note that the royal family doesn't really have an army. I'm sure they probably have enough money to, but their wealth doesn't even compare to the wealth of the merchant princes. And that's significant. That tells you how much wealth the merchant princes really do have. And then my last little fun fact is that the symbol of Antiva is a golden drake.
Right. It's very interesting, the emphasis on economic power, because it does play a factor in the other countries of Thedas, but there's so much in Ferelden, I feel like we have that traditional, hereditary nobility power structure. And then Orlais, there's, this blend between that and this religious theocracy power and other things like that. And then Tevinter is this magic is ruling.
Right, and I think the same is true, in Antiva, you do have that hereditary nobility line, but the real power doesn't. They're not the real power in the country. Like we're Ferelden, like the king of Ferelden or the queen of Ferelden, like that's it. The buck stops with them. Not so in Antiva.
It makes sense because, like, we talk about parallels to other countries, and, like, Antiva, Italia, like, Italy, there are big, like, Italy connections here, especially when you think of, the mob, and, like, the mob's connection to, like, in stereotypicals. I'm not Italian. I don't know what the mob thing is there, but, like, in the stereotypes, in what we think of, they always have this background, like, connection to this economic system that's going on in Italy. Like, they offer protections for the shops in their neighborhood and other things like that.
That's true. That's true. Well, that's all of my fun facts about Antiva, but I thought we could move into the ancient history a little bit, like we normally do. I don't have as much ancient history as I have in past episodes, but I still want to highlight a few things.
All right, well, let's do it.
Okay, so Antiva, their origins, I think their origins are really interesting. And they begin with pirates and mercenaries who settled on the coast of the Rialto Bay. They're kind of like escaping, not necessarily persecution, punishment for their crimes in other parts of Thedas. And I find that really interesting given the fact that Antiva is the place where it's the land of assassins. So I think that's really interesting that's their history too. It shows that our history really does impact us more than we might think. So yeah, I don't think that's a coincidence at all. But also in the ancient period, Antiva has a story of expansion. And one of the big things they do is that they expand their navy, which makes total sense since they're literally located on a bay. Most of their country is coastline. So, of course, naval military would be one of their priorities. But what I find interesting about this is that they were helped in this effort by a dwarf. His name was Beregrand, and he was from Gundar. And he just like had all this knowledge about the Navy. I don't really know how. It didn't tell me how. But he really is one of the ones that is credited with helping Antiva expand their naval power. Which then helped Antiva expand into its own nation. Instead of, staying like a group of city-states similar to the Free Marches.
Right. I think that that's interesting, and now that I really think about it, you would think that the dwarven cities of Orzammar and Antiva would be closely related because they're pretty similar in style because, Orzammar has its own noble caste that holds its own power, but the merchant caste is up there in, influence and power. And even Varric talks about you don't want to get on the wrong side of the merchant caste of the dwarves.
That's true. There's just so much cultural stuff with the dwarves. I don't think we can really compare it though.
But I could see them being friends because of the emphasis on the power of the merchants.
Yeah, no, I see that too. Okay, well, let's move into a little bit more modern history and culture, too. So, in 145 Divine, I know this is still kind of ancient age, but we're technically in the Divine Age. The teachings of Andraste are popularized in Antiva, and they convert. And to this day, they still primarily, officially at least, follow the teachings of the Chantry. And then a few other things about Antiva. There's no standing army. So it's not a leading military power, and this has been something that they've done for years and years and years. Obviously, it does, however, keep the deadliest assassins in Thedas, which were and are the Antivan Crows. So the Crows really function as their military, even though they're not. They're not a military, but they function in that kind of way for the country. But because they have no standing army, they always take a very strict attitude of neutrality during war and like border conflicts. So it's I get big Switzerland vibes. Like they want to be neutral. They don't want to be involved in politics. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later and like where that attitude came from. But I think it's important to highlight. So some more important historical events. Really, one of the biggest is the murder of Queen Madrigal. This happened in 599 Exalted Age, which is the end of an age. That was the end of the Exalted Age. So she was murdered on a hunt, and she was stabbed through the heart with 4 steel swords. And one of the swords was a replica of Hessarian's Sword of Mercy, and that's what he used to kill Andraste. So this was obviously a really big deal, really traumatic, really, shaking for the nation, right? And it also led to the naming of the next age, which was the Steel Age. So that's a really, really important thing.
One fun fact about the replica of Hessarian's sword, there's several of them that exist. They're prized possessions among the Tevinter nobility.
Yes.
You can actually find one in Dragon Age 2, and you can give it to Fenris, who I think you get it.
Oh, interesting.
You get it from Daenerys or someone.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, this murder of Queen Madrigal was a really accurate foreshadowing of that age, because it was in the early Steel Age when the Qunari arrived in Parvalan, and they began to expand all over the continent, like we've talked about. But between 632 and 642 Steel, Antiva is conquered by the Qunari, and they really wouldn't be freed from this until the next age, until 784 Storm. And that's when the Llomerryn Accord was signed, which is some kind of treaty. I didn't really remember. I don't remember what all that is, but we'll talk about it later. So that's another really big event in Antivan history. And then 2 more big events, I think. In 512 Exalted, the 4th Blight begins. And we talk about the 4th Blight all the time, I feel like. But the 4th Blight devastates, so much of Thedas. And this is really Antiva's darkest time, is the time of the 4th Blight. The entire country is ravaged, and the archdemon awakens. Andral is his name, and darkspawn begin to surface primarily in Antiva. And in Last Flight, the book, we get the picture of the entire royal family is basically killed by darkspawn during this blight, because they don't want to abandon their castle, they don't want to abandon their country, and the Grey Wardens are kind of like, look, y'all, this is dire. Like, y'all don't have time to wait anymore. And they are still not able to make a decision. And then finally, by the time the queen, I think, is like, okay, Grey Wardens, take us out, it's too late. And only one of them survives. So this is really one of their darkest times in history. And then my last historical moment to highlight from Antiva is in 899 Blessed, dragons reappeared. And they first showed up in Antiva, which led to the naming of the Dragon Age. Okay, well, let me highlight a few cultural things about Antiva before we move on into some important people. So, Antiva is known for the Antivan Crows, but it's also known for its wine. It's known for its sailing. It's known for its rich merchant history. Antiva has a real strong culture of romance, luxury, like zeal for life, and of course, danger as well. And another thing is that Antivans speak with a really strong Spanish accent. And in some cases, they even speak Spanish. Like Zevran, if you romance Zevran in Origins, he will often answer you, like prompting a conversation with him by saying "si amor" in Spanish, which means yes, love. So I think that's interesting. I think there are a lot of Spanish vibes. I think there are a lot of Italian vibes. Yeah, I think those are two of the biggest influences in creating Antiva, for sure. So what are your thoughts on Antiva?
I think that Antiva is definitely a place I want to see more of. I think that it would be interesting to get a view of some of the more minor players in Thedas. Yeah, that's really it. I think it would be interesting to kind of get involved in like whatever the political game of Antiva is. Just because I think it would be very different than what we've experienced in the game already.
Yeah, I agree. And I know they won't bring the hero of Ferelden back, but I would love to play as my hero of Ferelden, one of them who became an Antivan Crow, because you can become part of the Crows in Origins. I would love to go back and revisit that and like how that all plays out, because I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you can't really like be conscripted in the same way the rest of the Crows are. Like, it's just a little bit of a different situation. But if you haven't done that in Origins, basically what happens is you get approached by a guy in the marketplace in Denerim, and he's like, look, you clearly survived. You've clearly survived a lot. You've survived Antivan Crows already. We could use you. We could use your talent. And you got to do a few things to officially become part of the Crows. But then once you do, you get money, obviously. I think you can do a couple more quests. And then there's a shop that opens up in the marketplace in Denerim for you to buy more stuff. And most important, I think, is you get an extra vote in the Landsmeet. There's a person who shows up, like, I think it's like some distant noble is what their name is, but they're actually an Antivan Crow. And they vote for you in the Landsmeet.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I always become an Antivan Crow ever since I learned that, because I always need more votes in the Landsmeet because it never goes my way. Okay. Well, if you don't have any thoughts or questions, we can move on into some important Antivan people.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so the first person I want to highlight is a woman named Queen Asha. And her full name is Asha Sabira Bahadur Campana. And she was queen of Antiva during the Black Age.
She still doesn't have as many names as Cassandra.
No, she doesn't. But I wanted to talk about her because she is very often referred to as the Queen Mother of Thedas. She was born as a minor princess of Rivain, and she eventually grew to be one of the most important women on the continent because of her actions as queen. And she really played the game, rivaling any Orlesian for sure. So she was born in 430 Black in Rivain, like I just said, and she rose to a pretty important political status, where she was then betrothed to the prince, Prince Alonso Dario Campana of Antiva. A lot of people kind of looked down on this pairing, not necessarily because she was unworthy, but because they saw the prince as unworthy of her, because they saw him as someone who would be a weak king. But joke is on them, because this pair, they went on to do some incredible things throughout their marriage and reign. A Codex entry in Dragon Age Inquisition says that this is how powerful and how much she impacted Thedas. This is from Inquisition, and it's the Codex Queen Asha of Antiva. The marriage of a minor princess of Rivain to an almost powerless king was beneath their consideration. Yet this wedding was, in retrospect, perhaps the most important event in Thedas' history since the blackening of the Golden City.
Wow.
I know. So she is super duper important. And the reason why she's important is because of the way that she arranged marriages for her children. She had a lot of children, and she intentionally arranged marriages for them to people, powerful people, nobility, in rival countries and locations. Within 30 years, Antiva was so well connected that any hostile act against them would force at least half of Thedas into a war.
Wow.
Her bloodline is said to flow through the ruling families of Orlais, Navarra, Starkhaven, the Anderfels, and some of the magisters of the Tevinter Imperium. So that's like every country except for Ferelden.
Which is a big deal, because the magisters they almost want to keep that, like, they want their magisters want to marry other mages so that magic stays in the bloodline or whatever.
Well, they could have had a mage child that they married off into Tevinter.
That's true.
Because she is from Rivain, and Rivain has a very different view of magic, so it's very possible.
That's right. Did you find anything about magic in Antiva?
Not a lot, honestly. And it's hard because some of these more minor countries, we don't have a lot yet because we haven't gone to these places yet.
Right.
So I anticipate we'll learn a little bit more about them as the games progress. And, of course, if that does happen, if DA4 has a setting in Rivain or Antiva or any of these places we've talked about, we will of course revisit, and maybe redo this episode. So I wanted to go back to Queen Asha for just a second. But because of the way that she like intermarried her children into all of these royal houses, that's what allows Antiva to hold this political neutrality in every conflict. And they've just maintained that for forever.
Right.
So that's a little bit about Queen Asha.
That's pretty cool.
I know. I like her a lot. But moving on a little bit, my next topic is our favorite Assassins Guild, the Antivan Crows.
Woohoo!
Yeah, so, we're just gonna do a short bio about the Crows. And the Crows, as we know, are an infamous assassin guild. The guild is run by an incredibly secretive council. And this council is made up of 8 Talons. So like the talon on a crow. That's what they're made up of. That's their name. So currently, according to Tevinter Knights, now some of these people are dead, so it's not totally current. but it's as current as we can say for now. So, according to Tevinter Knights, the first Talon is Katarina Delamorte. The second Talon is Dante Balazar. The third Talon is Lyra Valisti. The fourth Talon is Emil Cortez. The fifth Talon is Viago de Riva. The sixth Talon is Bolivar Nero. The seventh Talon is Androtea Cantori. And the eighth Talon is Julie Ariani. So they are the Crow leadership. And if you're paying attention at all to that list of people that I just read off, you will have noticed and recognized at least one of the names. And that's Julie Ariani. That's the same last name as Zevran Ariani. And the reason for that is because these Talons, these leaders of the Crows, they very often take in, like homeless kids or people living on the streets, that kind of thing, and they give them a home, they give them food, and then therefore that person is indebted to the Crows. And so usually when you become a member of the Crows, underneath a certain Talon, you would then take their last name. That's what happens to Zevran. He basically is living in a brothel. His mom was a sex worker, and I guess the eighth Talon, Julie Ariani, or maybe the one before him, if it was another Ariani, took him under their wing, and he became a Crow through that way. So, more things about the Crows that we can talk about. The Crows actually started as an arm of the Chantry, believe it or not, in the hills north of Treviso, a city in Antiva. An order of monks used herbs grown in the gardens of their abbey to assassinate a maniacal duke. So that's how they started. So it's very assassinating, like backstabbing, poison kind of situation. And so from then they just kind of grew into this group that assassinates people for a living. So since that time, their deadly reputation and exotic poisons, because of those two things, the Crows have practically come to rule Antiva. Though honor in such an organization is generally not trustworthy. Like, you can't just trust somebody who says they're going to do something. They do adhere to one major standard. Contracts are met and agreements are kept. Failure to eliminate someone that you are supposed to kill means that your life is also forfeit. So that's what happens to Zevran.
Right.
He doesn't kill the hero of Ferelden, so he's so content to follow you because he knows if he does anything other than that, he's going to die. So it makes total sense that he would then follow the only person that he knows who could kill another Crow. You.
Yeah.
So the Crows are also a driving political force. Obviously, we already talked about the merchant princes having the power. And that's true. They have the power and wealth, but the Crows they're like the force behind that power. So they're often hired to assassinate Antivan nobility and royalty, and their reputation is enough to deter most nations from openly attacking Antiva, even though it doesn't have a standing army. And Zevran also implies in Origins that the Crows are just like an important part of Antivan society, like as a whole. They're not just something that's in the dark or in the shadows. They're not something that's hidden. They are just part of the society and culture generally. And like everyone knows who they are. They're important. They're recognized, but they're maybe not like promoted to outsiders.
It's interesting that Antiva has this claim of neutrality, which like officially, like from a noble and like political aspects, they do, but the Antivan Crows have been so involved in the politics of the rest of Thedas because they are hired as assassins.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, are they truly neutral?
Well, I mean, they would say they are because the Crows are not officially part of the government.
Yeah. I would also say that, this just shows that just because you're neutral doesn't mean that you're not involved.
And just because you're neutral doesn't mean you haven't picked a side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Well, do you want to talk about some notable Antivans?
Sure. All right, so here's our notable Antivans. So Zevran, obviously, and Queen Asha, who we talked about. Captain Aristide led an investigation of Queen Madrigal's murder and assassination. Castilian, an Antivan merchant who hired Isabel to escort a slave transport ship. That's events that take place during Dragon Age 2 with Isabella's quest. Oriana Kuzlin, sister-in-law of the human noble origin and DAO. Josephine. Commander Polara, the warden commander of Ferelden before Duncan. Master Ignacio, who is a merchant in Dragon Age Origins. Kaelin from Last Flight helped the Grey Wardens defeat Andriel in the Fourth Blight. And then Yavanna Antivan, Witch of the Wilds, daughter of Flemeth.
Yeah, we should have talked about Yavanna. She'll probably make another highlight in one of our episodes soon because she's probably really important. But we meet her in one of the comics. She's very similar to Morrigan. And she has a really interesting story. So we'll talk about her later.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break and go back into the middle of the show before we get into Rivain.
Perfect.
All right. See you after the break. All right, we're back, and we're here in the middle of the show to just kind of remind you that you can follow us on Twitter at DA Lorecast. Also, if you have questions about the lore, you can reach out to us on Twitter, or you can send us an email at dalorecast@gmail.com. Other than that, if you're looking for a way to support the podcast, one of the best ways to do that is to go into Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. If you really like what we do, if you like what we do about the podcast, please leave us that review. And we will read 5-star reviews out on the podcast during this time. And so Shelby has one to read for us today.
I do. This one is our first ever review, and it's from MLO 1920. And this is what MLO says. I've just started this podcast and I'm very much a fan of it already. As a Dragon Age fan, I've been hoping for a new podcast to listen to about the games and characters, so finding this was a nice treat. I'm looking forward to the interesting topics the hosts are going to dive into so I can learn more about the series. Keep up the great work.
Thanks, MLO.
Yeah.
All right, we'll get back to the Dragon Age Lorecast. Okay, Shelby, you ready to talk about Rivain?
I am ready to talk about Rivain.
All right.
I'm really fascinated with Rivain. And maybe it's because we know so little about it, and also there's this rumor that, like, Rivain is where the black people come from in Thedas, which I don't know where that came from. I don't know if that's true. But I definitely want them to explore more of Rivain. And also, like, I think representation of all races is important in these games. So if that's how Bioware does decide to, like, write the origin of people of color, I guess, in this continent, then I think we should go to Rivain. I think we should spend a significant amount of time in that location. So I don't have as many, like, fun facts as I normally do, just because we, again, know very little about Rivain, but I'll do my best. So Rivain is a very small country in the northeastern section of Thedas, and it is actually a peninsula off of Antiva. It is incredibly close to Parvalan. So in Rivain, probably out of anywhere else in Thedas, Rivain is most impacted by Qunari culture. So, Rivain is almost entirely surrounded by water, similar to Antiva. They have a matriarchal society, and they believe that women are just best suited to ruling. They are a monarchy, kind of goes along with that matriarchal monarchy. And its capital city is the city of Daresmond.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's all I have about Rivain. Like I said, we don't know as much about it.
Right.
Okay, but let's get into some of this older history.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Rivaini people from minus 120 to minus 153 ancient. No, I'm sorry. From minus 120 to minus 53 ancient. The Rivaini rebel from Tevinter. And they don't want to be part of the Imperium anymore. This is before even Antiva, I think, has split from the Imperium. Mm-hmm. But they're really supported by a lot of the city-states and the free marches. And we'll talk more about the free marches next week. But minus 44 ancient is the official founding of the kingdom of Rivain. So they gained their independence pretty early. Like I said, they were kind of settled by Tevinter, or at least ruled by Tevinter. I would assume, I couldn't find this information anywhere, but I would assume that Rivain was kind of settled by the same group of like pirates, mercenaries, same kind of similar history as Antiva, since it is a peninsula off of Antiva. But I think in Rivain, more than any other place in Thedas, Rivain has more of like an indigenous story where the people who are just indigenous to this land have lived there for forever. And I think you get some of that with like the matriarchal stuff, and their view of magic has just kind of been around for a long time. And we don't know the full history of that. So that might change in future books and content. But for now, the best we can kind of do is guess at some of that history. So we're going to skip forward a little bit. The fourth blight. I know I feel like we talk about like three things every episode. I always talk about the fourth blight. I always talk about a novel, and I always talk about the Chantry. Oh, and we always talk about Tevinter. But like these things are like lasting impressions in Dragon Age. And if I had to emphasize one thing, it would be that these things that we always talk about have so much influence in the world that you just may not get by a simple playthrough. You just may not realize how much Tevinter impacted every part of this planet.
I mean, Tevinter almost conquered the entire continent.
Right, almost. And you could argue that it took an act of God, an act of the Maker, for them to be stopped. So, anyway, the fourth blight is disastrous for Rivain, just like it is for Antiva. Darkspawn are everywhere. It's basically conquered. It falls pretty easy. I mean, once Antiva falls, there's no hope for Rivain. I mean, where do you go? A ship? Like, great, but you can't live on a ship for the length of a blight. You never know how long a blight could be. So, anyway, in 524 Exalted, Rivain is finally freed from the Darkspawn explosion. When Andorral is finally defeated in Garahel, or is finally defeated by Garahel, and this happens in Aisley, which is a city in Rivain. So that finally happens after a long time. But then pretty soon after that, like 100 years in the next age, the Qunari conquer Rivain. And unlike Antiva, the Qunari are never fully ousted from Rivain. They definitely, their presence their culture, they last much longer than anywhere else. So the Chantry does send exalted marches against the Kunari. And actually both Chantries declare exalted marches against the Kunari in Rivain. And the Tevinter Imperium's Imperial Chantry declares exalted marches to retake Saharan and Quirinus at the same time. And the regular Chantry, I don't know what the right word, the Orlesian Chantry maybe, declares an exalted march to retake Rivain. So like all of these are happening at the same time. They're all fighting the both the Chantries are all fighting the Kunari. So that's a really big deal that both Chantries would be united in something. So I think that's significant. But there's this constant conflict between the teachings of the Kun and the teachings of the Chantry. I think we're coming to a head with that a little bit more in the next game. At least if the Kunari can get over their infighting. But in this time, in the Storm Age, they're fighting for the culture of Rivain, because Rivain is one of the only places throughout Thedas whose culture is anything close to a melting pot. Because you do have this Chantry culture, but you also have the indigenous culture with these matriarchs. In Rivain, you have that kind of thing. And then you also have the impact of Antiva, of course. And you have now this new influence with the Kunari. And that's really a lot of conflicting cultural groups right there. And so that really does impact how Rivain sees itself and just how it exists now.
Yeah.
So, unlike the majority of people in Thedas, the Rivaini they're not Andrastians. They're not officially declared to the Chantry, and they don't really believe in the Maker. Instead, their indigenous kind of beliefs persist. They're pantheists who believe in a natural order, and so many hold to the belief that their god and the universe are the same. Though technically Rivain's royalty is Andrastian, the Chantry doesn't have any authority beyond the capital of Daresmond. So another important thing to talk about with the Kunari is that Rivain has some of the only cities in Thedas outside of Parvalan and Saharan that are controlled by the Kunari. That's really a big deal. There's a lot of Rivaini people, especially in the city of Kantar, that have just converted to the Kun entirely. So this is a big deal, even though the country is not technically betrothed or converted to the Chantry. The Kun clearly has a very big role to play. So I wanted to read a quote from Brother Ferdinand Genetivi. And he is the brother of the Chantry that you meet in Origins. He's the one that takes you to the Temple of Sacred Ash. But this is what he has to say about Rivain. The chant of light never truly reached the ears of these people. Resistance to the chant goes deeper than the Kunari wars. The Rivaini refuse to be parted from their seers, wise women who are in fact hedge mages, communicating with spirits and actually allowing themselves to be possessed. The Chantry prohibition against such magical practices violates millennia of local tradition in Rivain. So, this is talking about how Rivain sees magic, which I think is kind of contradictory to the Kun. But maybe since it's very hedge mage, kind of not trained magic, you can kind of get around that. But the Rivaini have these seers, these women that are basically, not necessarily predicting the future, but that kind of stuff. And the people are obsessed with it. Like, they don't want to give that up. Of course, it's their culture. And so these women, that they're part of the ones that are part of this matriarchal society that have power in this matriarchal world. And they're really hedge mages. So a few episodes ago, I can't remember, maybe it was in our Tevinter episode, but I made the comment that was basically like, I can only think of one country in Thedas that interprets that line in the Chant of Light about magic is meant to serve man, not rule over him. I could only think of one country outside of Tevinter that interprets that differently, and that one country is Rivain. The circles in Rivain are just so much more lenient than the circles in the rest of Thedas because of this culture of these hedge mage women. It's just totally different. So I think that the chantry leaders in Rivain, and because of the conflicting culture, just generally, definitely see magic through different eyes. So another important thing to note about magic in Rivain. A circle did exist in Daresmond, but it was really just like a means to appease the chantry. It was lenient, like I said. The mages were allowed to like go home and see their families, and the women were specifically trained to be seers. And so there are some of these seer women that were more than just hedge mages. They had more magical training because of the circle, but they educate apprentices like in this magic, and they're allowed tons of freedom and even assist Templars when needed. So the Rivaini circle is very different from the rest of Thedas, and I think this is actually a better model for the circles than the rest of Thedas, but we don't have time to get into that conversation. But another important aspect of this is that according to the first enchanter of the Daresmond Circle, when the other circles rose up in rebellion, starting the Mage Templar War in the events of Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, when the Chantry discovered in 940 Dragon how the Daresmond Circle operated, they declared all of the mages as apostates and used the rite of annulment to destroy the circle entirely and kill all of its mages.
That seems smart.
Well, I mean, it's very smart if you want a war.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I think that was really a big turning point in that conflict. I'm kind of the opinion that if that hadn't happened, they maybe could have prevented some of the things that happened. But yeah, I mean, that's a big deal, and they do mention it, I think, in Inquisition. Like, there's some side comments about it. And if you read Asunder, there are comments about it too, at the end of that book, when they have, like, their gathering of all the mages. Do you have any thoughts about magic in Rivain?
Not really, other than I do think it's interesting, the, like, freedom that exists there. I see a lot of parallels between the Ravani and the Roma people.
The Rivaini?
Yeah, the Rivaini and the Roma people.
Interesting. Okay.
Just kind of like the way they talk about seers and other things like that. And like the emphasis on matriarchal societies really just kind of give me that vibe.
Yeah, I don't really know anything about the Roma people, so I don't want to say I agree or don't agree, but yeah. Oh, and one more thing I wanted to add about culture. I forgot this earlier. So social standing in Rivain is very often marked by tattoos and or body piercings. So the more elaborate, like your decorations, your body modifications, the higher your rank in society. So obviously they have very extravagant jewelry, and I think we kind of see that with Isabella a little bit. I don't think we've seen anybody else with a facial piercing in Dragon Age except for her.
Yeah. I think you're right.
At least yet.
Yeah. All right. You ready to talk about our side character?
Actually, I wanted to talk about a couple of people with Rivain origins first.
Oh, yeah. Let's go.
So, Queen Asha of Antiva, like we talked about earlier, she is originally from Rivain. Isabella is Rivaini. Duncan is from Rivain, and it's said that Vivienne de Fer also has some Rivaini descent, even though I think she considers herself to be from the Free Marches.
She does. She says that.
Yeah, so those are some notable Rivaini people.
Well, cool.
Okay, so I am now ready to talk about our side character.
All right, let's get into it.
Okay, well, our side character for the day is from Antiva. I would have tried to choose someone from both, but I couldn't. There wasn't really anyone. So, except for Queen Asha, but we already talked about her. So, our side character for the day is the 7th Talon, Andaratea Cantori. So, Andaratea is probably my favorite of all of the Talons. I really, really loved her in Tevinter Nights. That's where she shows up first. I think she also shows up in a comic, but I really like her a lot. Her nickname, she's often called Tea. And she was made a Talon by the age of 28. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, she's the youngest one in history. So I like her a lot. And there are a lot of people who think that Tea is... There's a woman in the Dragon Age 4 trailer. There's a woman in that trailer that is... she's an Antivan Crow, and she has like kind of long hair. So there's a lot of people that think that that person in the trailer is Tea. So there's a lot of people that think she'll be in Dragon Age 4. I would love that. I would love that. So let me give you a little bit of bio about her. So Tea grew up as a thief on the streets of Antiva City before she joined the Crows. She obviously did not have a lot of money. She didn't have any family. She had a very rough life as a child. And she joined the Crows. She was recruited into the Crows by Katerina Delamort, who's like the main leader of the Crows. And so Tea saw the Crows as her family because she didn't have anyone before she joined the Crows. And she even saw Katerina as the mother she never had. Her rise to power caused a lot of controversy within the Crows because she didn't have the family or the connections that most people who arise to leadership within the Crow organization, they usually have some kind of connection, some kind of family power. She didn't have any of that. She was just good. So Tea is said to be very beautiful. She's also a master seductress, and she specializes in the killing of cruel men. So that's a little bit about her. I want to dive into the content in Tevinter Nights because this is where we meet more of who she is. This is where we really meet her. This is where we get the bulk of her story so far. So in Antiva, Tea attends a meeting of the 8 Talons. This meeting is called by Katerina to discuss how in the world they're going to defend Antiva from the potential Qunari invasion. The meeting is to take place at like a villa on an island without bodyguards, without servants. And this is to prevent anything from getting out, anyone from getting in, all of that kind of stuff. It's very secretive. Everyone's very defensive. Taya and Viago, another Talon, they arrive together. They're trying to convince the others that their houses are united. And they have worked on several contracts together. And they also have some unresolved feelings for each other. This is going to be a little bit of a theme. So, they arrive. They all have dinner. Whatever. The main stuff is going to start the next day. Well, Taya and Viago go to the room of Lyra Valisti, one of the other Talons, to talk to her. And instead they find her murdered in her chambers later that night. And they found her murdered in the same way as Queen Madrigal, which with the 4 steel blades protruding from her chest. So this is an imitation of Queen Madrigal's assassination. And they find traces of lyrium underneath her fingernails. And so one of the other Talons, Julia Ariani, accuses Dante Balazar, another of the Talons, of this murder because he is a well-known lyrium addict and very frequently argued with Lyra, even arguing with her at that dinner. So Taya defends Dante because they were formerly lovers. So you can sense a little bit of a love triangle here. So Taya defends Dante from these accusations. But the next morning, they find Julie. He's also been dead. He's also been killed. He's been murdered. In another reenactment of a famous assassination. So 2 Talons are dead. Both killed in the same way that another famous leader was killed. So now we have a pattern, right? So the villa's 8 servants, all they had were 8 servants at the time. The servants have also been poisoned. Another reenactment. Suspicions fall on Viago, who Taya arrived with, because he's a master poisoner. Taya defends him. She doesn't think that he's the one that's done it because she's been with him most of the night, and that would implicate her too. Well, she offers to lie for him to give him an alibi, but he says no. And then Katerina orders him and Dante and Taya, they're all locked in their rooms. They're all suspects. They need to stay away from each other. They need to stay away from anyone. Well, Taya decides during this time she's going to get out of her room. She goes and interrogates Dante. Because she thinks that he's the one that did it. Because Dante and Lyra, the first murder, they were lovers too. More recently than Dante and Taya had been lovers. I know this is like kind of confusing, but anyway. So she interrogates Dante. She ends up believing him that he's not the one that did it. And she leaves, goes back to her room. Well, the next day she finds out that he's been assassinated as well. So she then goes back to Viago and is like, oh my God, I've just found Dante. Dante is in the process of dying when she finds him because he's been poisoned. The master poisoner has been poisoned. So she basically rescues him and finds the antidote really quickly and saves his life. So there were a few errors. All of these murders were reenactments. There are a few errors in the reenactments. And so that allows Taya and Viago to figure out that the murderer, the assassin, is Emil Cortez. And he's one of the Talons. So what happened is, with all of this murder, Viago and Taya uncover that it's Emil. And Emil made a deal with the Qunari to kill all the Talons and throw the Antivan Crows into chaos, believing that the Qunari would uphold their promise to invade peacefully and not force conversion on to the Qun on Antiva. Which, to me, I'm like, okay, well, you're dumb because they would never uphold that promise. Mm-hmm. Number 2, so now you're just, like, I know you're part of this Assassin's Guild, but, like, you're just going to murder all your friends? Like, okay. But back to Taya a little bit. So she's the one that figures out all of these murders. She's the one that figures out that it's really Emil. She's the one that saves Viago's life. And I think that's really important. She's a really young woman. She's not, as established as some of these other Talons are. And I think she has a lot of potential to grow with the series. And I'm really interested to see how this story specifically continues. Like, how will the Crows recover from this? Because Tevinter Nights just kind of leaves it up in the air. It doesn't give us a conclusion. They kill Emil, the rest of the Talons that are left. But 3 of the Talons have been assassinated. Almost 4. But 3 of them were assassinated. And Taya's one of the ones that are left alive. So we don't know how this story is going to play out yet.
Right.
But I do have 2 fun facts about Taya, other than this story of murder and assassination. The tattoo that marks Taya as a member of House Cantori is on her back. And all of the houses, they have these tattoos that mark them as members of the houses. And then second is that Taya named her horse Andorau after the archdemon who led the 4th Blight, because she thought it was funny. Okay, well, do you have any other last thoughts about Antiva or Rivain?
I do not.
Okay, me neither.
All right, well, thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. As always, you can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast. If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, email them to us at daLorecast@gmail.com. The Dragon Age Lorecast is a part of the Robots Radio Rocket Club. You can join the Robots Radio Network Discord by clicking the link in our episode description. If you enjoyed our show, we'd love it if you'd subscribe and give us a review. See you next time.
Ever wanted to be a content creator but had no clue where to begin? Come join me as I sit down with content creators that have already faced the challenges you're up against, as they discuss the tips and tricks that help them be successful. Here on The Content Creator's Guide, available wherever podcasts can be found.